This is Garry Momber. My talk is The Prehistoric World Beneath the Waves. Before I begin, I'll warn you that I'm not very proficient at this new method of presentation where I have nothing but a screen to look at. So please bear with me as I work with the technology and give the talk as if it was to a live audience. First, we should consider why archaeological sites exist within submerged landscapes. This was because sea level was up to 130 meters lower during the last ice age, or even 140 meters, and this exposed a lot of the continental shelf. As the climate warmed, the ice began to melt, allowing plants and animals to move north. These were followed by people, and then, as millennia passed, the glaciers melted further, and the sea level rose behind them. The rising waters covered the landscape, but in doing so, it eroded the high spots and filled in the valleys and river channels, should I say, with the sediment. This sediment covered these old landscapes and protected them in oxygen-free environments. And today I'm going to look at one such environment, which is the Western Solent. That's the blue area in the middle of the screen, with the Isle of Wight to the south and mainland England to the north. 8,000 years ago, the Western Solent was an ice-sheltered river valley, and it was just seeing the ingress of the sea, which came in to form an estuary. And the estuary developed for the next 5,000 years, and sediments were dropped and deposited all over the land surface. Then about 3,000 years ago, the western end by Hurstspit broke through, and that formed the Solent Seaway. And with that, the tides were going backwards and forwards, and they slowly started to excavate and get rid of all those sediments that were laid in the first place. However, some of those sediments do remain, and they remain around the fringes of the Solent. Here at Lymington, you can see quite extensive mudflats at low water, and those mudflats are sitting on top of old land surfaces that are made up of peat inlaid with trees, and you can actually see those further offshore where the mudflats have eroded away and the landscapes are exposed in about 4 meters of water. These are about sort of 5,000–6,000 years old. But further to the east, a lot of that covering the mudflat deposit has been eroded away, and we're down to the bedrock. But within that bedrock, we still do find pockets of paleo-environmental material and paleochannels, and some of these have archaeological material remaining within them. One such site were these lines of posts at Calshot that were discovered following storms a few years ago. These run parallel to the shore, down at the low water mark, sort of where you can just about see on the right-hand side. Now, these aren't very substantive, and we thought they might be associated with fishing, but we dated them and they came back at Romano-Celtic, between 40 BC and 140 AD. Now, interestingly, not only do they tell us about Roman occupation along the northwest Solent, but they also tell you about the nature of the landscape, because for these to have survived when the sea level was 3 or 4 meters higher than above the sites would be very unlikely if they were stuck in open water. So invariably they would have been within mudflats or marshes, which must have stretched much further into the Solent at the time. The one good thing about the high water on them at the moment is that we can use that to work on them, and we can do diving archaeology on the site as we did to excavate some of the posts. Working underwater, we removed the silt to reveal nicely preserved timbers along the edge of the causeway. These included the large ones, which date to around 148 AD, but we also saw older ones much lower down. These ones here show that there's different stages of development within the causeway itself. We were also very impressed by the levels of conservation. You can see on these posts cut marks, very fresh, almost as if they were done last year, being conserved within those oxygen-free sediments. But these weren't the only ones. Just 10 meters away, a bit further seaward, we found a bunch of other structures. We thought they were all associated, but these were a bit more complicated. We investigated further and we discovered these posts of a different character. Again, also with very nice fine cut marks on them, slightly different cut marks than the earlier ones. They were dated, and the dates came back at 1370 BC. So what we have here is a Bronze Age complex as well as Roman. The site was recorded using photogrammetry. These were hundreds of photographs that we stitched together. We found this the most effective way to get a record of the whole site, and this was done underwater. And you can see from it, which is a green strip in the background of this picture, you can see on the right hand side is the east, and then at the top left is sort of the west southwest. You can see that it stretches, in fact, it stretches for about 60 to 70 meters between the causeway and the Bronze Age structures at the end. So it was a very complicated area, an area that was revisited for at least 1500 years. So it must have been a significant site between the Bronze Age and the Roman periods. And it's interesting because the further you go down the beach, the further you tend to go back in time. And going back in time we will. Now I'm taking you to an intertidal forest that's exposed right at the low water mark a bit further down the northwest Solent. Here we have a bunch of trees that dated to about 5,200 years old from the Neolithic period. And they would have all fallen and toppled as sea level came in and poisoned their roots, so they're a direct reflection of sea level rise at the time. This landscape was associated with the Paleochannel, and on the other side of the channel, the old waterway, we found these interesting posts, a line of about 6 or 7 posts. We've seen one of them here. This was recovered a year or so ago, and you can see cut marks on it. It's been trimmed and cut, and it's covered in a resin, and the resin seems to be impregnated with stones. It looks like they were protecting those bits of timber, maybe from the encroaching sea. They date about 5,100 years old, so it looks like the sea was around at the time. So here we have some wonderful indications, not only in an index point to show us where sea level was at the time, but also to show how people were adapting to sea level change in the Neolithic. To survey the site, we used a drone survey with the same principle as working underwater to take thousands of photographs which can then be stitched together to create a geo-reference plan. To investigate the underwater Paleochannel, we ran a bunch of cores from east to west across the whole area to see if we could pick up on some of the underlying substrates to work out what was happening beneath the silt and sediment. This enabled us to produce a digital terrain model, and within it we've annotated the areas where there's archaeology and peat deposits associated with the paleo-environmental landscape. On the right hand side you can see all those stars. They represent wooden posts that were found within the peat area. The peat area is defined by the oval shapes. Between the peat we had the Paleochannel, the sediment associated with the channel running down, which goes from north to south into the Solent. And further to the left we found another bunch of posts, wooden posts. Anomalous, these pushed straight down into the underlying geological clays. So it's a complicated site. Currently covered with a big gravel bank in the middle, but the things of interest in particular are the archaeological artifacts. The most recent discovery is what appears to be the base of a fishing basket. Now this is only really exposed at the low water mark right at the bottom of the tide. These are a bunch of posts coming out of the seabed, and they're surrounded by wattle which ties them together. So one could place a fish or crustacea inside it to preserve it. Now, for this to be effective, there needs to be water. So it's probably later than in Neolithic, although it's the same level on the coastline. It probably dates maybe to the Bronze Age or even later to the Saxon. We've taken some cores from the site, which will analyze pollen and diatoms within it, and we've also put out a sample for dating. When that information comes through and we got a better idea of what we're dealing with, we'll go back to it at another low water spring tide and see if we can conduct some meaningful excavation. But as the mudflats erode away from all of the northwest Solent, more and more of these artifacts are going to be discovered. They've been very well preserved for hundreds, if not thousands of years, but now they're found, they will be lost. They'll be lost, and all the knowledge that goes with them will be lost. And also their direct indication of erosion on the coastline, so they have a secondary value as well. But now I'm going to move from the northwest Solent to another area where there's ongoing erosion on the coastline and underwater. This is Boulden Hill, the bottom of which is being eroded away by the Solent to form a cliff, and you can see on the beach below a whole line of trees that are lying down and they got embedded in the shingle. Underwater we have another cliff. This is a product of different formation processes, but it looks similar. The top area where it's fairly white is about 4 meters of water. It then drops down to below those little vertical cliffs to about 11 meters of water, and then you have a long green bench, which is similar to the beach on the surface, but this is in fact a bench inlaid with trees, but it's made of peat. It's part of the old land surface, and it's the bit that's sticking out from underneath those relic mudflat sediments on the left, and on the right we have a small cliff that's been eroded away and continually being destroyed as the Solent grows. Diving underwater to the bottom of the cliff, we come to the remains of that old submerged forest. At the top of the picture, we can see an old oak tree that's falling down, and it's still got its bark on it. On the left, the dark area is the peat deposit that's being eroded away, and in the middle is a nice excavating lobster that's worked its way into the peat and the sand below. That excavating lobster recovered worked flints for the first time discovered in UK waters about 20 years ago. Following the initial discovery by the lobster, we've been going back every year to try and rescue and recover artifacts as the cliff erodes behind them. What we found are hundreds of worked flint tools. These all date to the Mesolithic. This is 8,000 years ago, and we know that first typologically, but also because we've dated a lot of the organic material. The worked pieces themselves are made of a fine dark flint. A lot of it you can find coming out the cliffs that cut across the Isle of Wight and at the Needles. On the left we have a selection of different cores being recovered, and on the right we have flakes that have been turned into sort of bladelets, blades and scrapers. We found hundreds of these artifacts just eroding from beneath the cliff. We also found tools, and here we have an adze. We found a couple of other pieces of adze as well, but this is a whole one. It would have been hafted, and it was a tool that would have been used during the Mesolithic for trimming trees and maybe boat building. We also found hand tools, including this one on the right, that would have been used for sort of cutting or scraping or chopping. But what's been really significant about the area is the preservation of organic material, again from these anaerobic sediments that are oxygen free. These leaves, these oak leaves that were recovered from near that hand axe, look like they came up about last year from the forest, but like everything else, they are between 7,900 to 8,000 years old. The artifacts we're discovering are starting to give insights into the technology of these Mesolithic people. Here we have some string, the oldest piece of string yet discovered in the UK, and it was twisted and prepared using nettle. But an important role of the old woodland is to actually defend the woodland bench, we call it, from ongoing erosion. And what we can see, these root systems here with some trees, and they're right on the shelf that's being eroded away, but they're protecting it, and they're acting, you could say, as sentinels against the ongoing abrasion from the Solent. That tree I just showed you comes from about 400 meters away from where the lobster did the initial excavation. It's a site called BC5. And this is very important because rather than lots of flint tools, we're finding lots of worked wood and woodworking activity. Here we have another one of those nice 3D models. This one about 800 photographs stitched together, but it shows you the edge that's eroding away. These strong pointy bits that's sort of sticking out, these promontories, small promontories, are effectively the remains of root systems holding back the erosion. Meanwhile, within the embayments, we're finding archaeological material being exposed as that peat deposit recedes. When we look at an annotated image of that 3D model, we can see where some of that archaeological material is coming from. And at the bottom, you can see where the area has been eroded, that drops deeper into the Solent. A whole series of posts have been recovered. And of particular interest to us are these platforms, and just in the middle on the right, there's what appear to be a platform laid on the seabed that started to be exposed, and we've since recovered it, started to be exposed as that peat was removed from it. These wooden platforms, as we call them, were a series of timbers laid out in an organised fashion on the seabed. Individually, they were hard to tell from natural, but collectively they formed little structures. But they were flat on one side and round on another, which was fairly common with all of them. So we set about some experimental archaeology to see if we could work out how they were made. So, with the help of Exbury Gardens, who provided us with a large piece of oak trunk, we started to use traditional Mesolithic flints and tools to work on the tree to see if we could convert it and produce the offcuts that we found on the site. The first thing we discovered is that adzes weren't very effective when working with a hard oak tree, so we had to burn it. And to do that, we heated up flints similar to the ones that we'd found on the site and carbonized the wood, turning it to charcoal. Then we could remove it quite readily with flint. We also used antlers, and using the antlers, we could split the timber along the line of the bark and the sapwood, and by doing that, we would produce timbers about 30 to 50 centimeters long that were round on one side and flat on the other. And these were just the sorts of timbers we were discovering on our most recent find last year, when we had another platform of about 60 pieces of timber, many of which were round on one side and flat on the other. Here we have the base of the platform being reconstructed on the surface, but then when we add all the other pieces to the top of it, you can see it forms a bit of a well-organized matrix stretching 2 meters by 1 meter long. This is a significant site because, one, it links into the woodworking activities in the area, and also it happens to be the most cohesive 8,000-year-old Mesolithic structure that's been recovered to date in the UK. People that would like to see that more close up can visit it on our Sketchfab, Maritime Archaeology Sketchfab website, where you can look at it and you can spin it around and see it in all its 3D glory. For those that would like to see the collection of different models I've been showing today, you just need to go to sketchfab.com, Maritime Archaeology Trust models. You can see the address at the top of this slide. So returning to BC5 on the seabed, this area here is immediately to the east of the area I showed you earlier with the spinny around little video. What it shows you is the location of some of those platforms. WFO4 is a platform that we recovered. There's another one, WFO5. We noticed a tree stump in the middle that's eroding away and everything's receding. But an important area was WFO2 on the far right hand side of the image. This is right in the center of BC5, and it was an area that we excavated in 2007. WFO2 was an area where there was a lot of woodworking activity, many pieces of worked wood, lots of burnt flints and carbonized flints that have been reused, and central to it all was a large oak tree, the evidence of which we found within the plank that's still on site. This came from a tree that was about 2 meters wide and maybe 20 or 30 meters long. So what we have is a tree that was being trimmed and stripped and burnt and worked, just as we saw, to make these platforms around the region. It was invariably a Mesolithic logboat, making this the oldest boat building site in the world. But that wasn't all, because DNA was collected from sediment within the site. This identified a number of species of animal, rodents, geese, dog, auroch, a type of cow, and also a lot of the vegetation. And within that vegetation, there was einkorn, and einkorn is particularly significant because it was domesticated wheat, and that wasn't supposed to arrive to the UK for at least another 2,000 years. So it looks like the people that lived on this site were working with or connecting with people from further east in Europe and travelling back and forth. This is where their logboat would have come in handy, because Britain was still connected to Europe at the same time. The North Sea hadn't quite been formed, and there was connections up and down the river. So this site tells us so much about the individual people that lived there, but also how it's interconnected with the rest of Europe. I will finish with a reconstruction of the site where you can see a logboat being built there on the right. We can see the evidence of dog on the left, auroch in the background, and in the middle a nice little fire where it looks like there's some bread being baked after it's being made. So if you had some auroch meat thrown into that bread, you have a site also with the oldest beef burger in the world, but yet to be discovered.